There's a tree in my backyard that I'm honestly a little embarrassed to talk about. A full-grown apple tree, healthy, beautiful, leaves so green they almost looked painted, that hadn't produced a single fruit in 7 years. 7 years of watering, fertilizing, pruning on schedule, following every piece of advice from every gardening forum I could find. I spent somewhere around $200 on specialty bloom boosters, phosphorus supplements, and hormone sprays that promised to unlock fruiting potential. The tree just kept growing. Lush, leafy, absolutely fruitless. The morning everything changed, I wasn't following any expert advice. I was frustrated. I walked out to that tree, rolled up a newspaper as tight as I could, and hit the trunk. Not out of science, out of pure exasperation. My neighbor watched from across the fence with an expression that clearly said he was reconsidering our friendship. But 11 weeks later, for the first time in 7 years, that tree was covered in blossoms. I didn't understand what had happened. So I started digging, not in the garden, but through research papers, agricultural archives, and the kind of obscure horticultural literature that nobody reads anymore. What I found didn't just explain why my tree finally bloomed. It exposed something much bigger, a mechanism that farmers have known about for thousands of years, that modern plant science has fully documented, and that the $200 billion fertilizer and crop stimulant industry has absolutely no financial interest in telling you about. Because here's the truth that will reframe everything you think you know about growing fruit trees. Your tree doesn't need more nutrients to produce fruit. In many cases, it needs the opposite. It needs to believe, on a biological level, that it might not survive, that this could be its last season, and you can trigger that response for exactly $0. What I'm about to show you isn't a gardening trick. It's a window into how plants actually think, survive, and decide when to reproduce. It's a story that starts in ancient olive groves around the Mediterranean, runs through Roman agricultural manuals, wins through a Columbia University laboratory in 1973, and ends in your backyard with a rolled-up newspaper and a tree that's finally ready to give you everything it's been holding back. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll never look at a struggling fruit tree the same way again. Long before anyone had heard of fertilizer bags stacked at a garden center, long before the concept of bloom booster existed in any language, farmers in the ancient Mediterranean already knew something that modern horticulture spent decades trying to rediscover. They knew that a comfortable tree is a lazy tree, and they knew exactly what to do about it. In the olive groves of ancient Greece and Rome, groves that in some cases are still producing fruit today, 2,000 years later, farmers practiced something that would look absolutely brutal to a modern gardener. When an olive tree grew strong and leafy but refused to fruit, they didn't feed it. They beat it. They used wooden clubs, the blunt ends of farming tools, sometimes the flat side of a stone. They struck the trunk repeatedly, not with the intention of damaging the tree, but with the very specific goal of frightening it into reproduction. The Romans even had a name for the principle behind it, embedded in their agricultural writing: the idea that a tree must sense its own vulnerability before it will commit to bearing fruit. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, documented methods of wounding fruit trees to increase their yield, describing how farmers would drive wooden stakes into the base of unproductive trees, or twist and stress the main branches until the tree redirected its energy away from growth and into fruiting. This wasn't cruelty. It was an intuitive understanding of plant biology that these farmers had accumulated across generations of close observation. A knowledge system built not in laboratories but in fields, passed from father to son, from one agricultural community to the next, across centuries of Mediterranean farming culture. The same instinct appeared independently, thousands of miles away. In rural Japan, farmers growing persimmon and plum trees developed a ritual that has been practiced for so long its exact origins are difficult to trace. In late autumn after harvest, a farmer would take a wooden mallet and walk the orchard, striking each trunk with measured, deliberate blows. Then, in a tradition that has survived into the modern era in some regions, the farmer would hold a short ritual conversation with the tree, asking whether it intended to fruit the following year, and answering for it. Yes, it would. The striking and the ritual were understood as a single act. The physical stress and the intention were inseparable. What the farmers understood instinctively, and what we now understand scientifically, is that the blow was the message. The tree received it and responded. In the Middle East, in South Asia, in pre-colonial Mesoamerica, across cultures that had no contact with one another, variations of the same practice emerged. Farmers girdled trees by cutting shallow rings through the outer bark. They bent branches and secured them in stressed positions for weeks at a time. They drove copper nails into trunks. They exposed roots and left them to face the dry season before covering them again. Each technique, in its own way, was delivering the same biological signal. Your situation is precarious. The time to reproduce is now. And then, in the 20th century, almost all of it disappeared. Not because it stopped working, not because someone proved it was wrong. It disappeared because it became unnecessary, or rather because an entire industry arose to make farmers believe it was unnecessary. The global fertilizer market, which today stands at just under $200 billion per year, was built on a single foundational premise, that what your plant needs is always something you can buy. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, bloom stimulators, rooting hormones, synthetic auxins and gibberellins in carefully measured bottles with scientific-sounding labels. The ancient knowledge, the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for a fruit tree costs absolutely nothing, quietly disappeared into the background. It wasn't suppressed dramatically, it was simply never mentioned, never taught, allowed to fade while the industry that replaced it grew into one of the most profitable agricultural sectors in human history. What the old farmers knew and what the industry never advertised is that you cannot buy your tree into fruiting if the tree has already decided it has no reason to fruit. And understanding why that is, understanding the actual biology of what happens inside a tree when it gets struck, stressed, or threatened, is where this story gets genuinely extraordinary. Here is something that most people who have spent years gardening still don't fully appreciate. A plant is not passive, it is not a static, silent thing that simply absorbs whatever you give it and grows accordingly. A plant is a sensing organism, continuously gathering information about its environment, processing that information at a cellular level, and making what can only be described as decisions about how to allocate its resources. It has no brain. It has no nervous system in any way comparable to an animal's. And yet it responds to its world with a sophistication that, once you understand it, makes the idea of just pouring fertilizer on a struggling tree and expecting results seem almost naive. The field of study that examines how plants sense and respond to physical touch, pressure, and mechanical force is called thigmomorphogenesis. It is not a fringe theory. It is not alternative science. It is a well-documented, peer-reviewed area of plant biology that has been studied seriously since the early 1970s, when a researcher named Mordecai Jaffe at Columbia University began publishing work that would quietly reshape how plant physiologists understood growth and development. Jaffe's early experiments were elegantly simple. He subjected young plants to repeated mechanical stimulation, rubbing, bending, shaking, and measured what happened. What happened was not what most people would expect. The plants didn't weaken. They didn't show signs of stress in the way an animal would. Instead, they changed. They grew shorter and thicker. They increased the density of their cell walls. They became, in measurable and reproducible ways, structurally stronger and biologically more alert. What Jaffe had documented was the plant equivalent of a stress response, not a damage response, not a dying response, but an adaptation response. The plant sensed mechanical pressure, interpreted it as environmental instability, and immediately began restructuring itself to survive that instability. It wasn't reacting to being hurt. It was reacting to the information that its world had become unpredictable and that it needed to prepare accordingly. To understand why this matters for fruiting, you need to understand something about how a healthy, well-fed tree allocates its energy on any given growing season. A tree in ideal conditions, good soil, reliable water, no competition, no threat, operates in what plant biologists call a vegetative growth phase. It is focused entirely on expanding itself. More leaves, more branches, more root mass. More height. This is the tree investing in its own infrastructure, building out its capacity to capture sunlight and water, maximizing its own survival. From the tree's perspective, in a stable and comfortable environment, this is the rational strategy. Why spend energy producing fruit and seed when conditions are good, resources are available, and there's no indication that anything is about to change? The tree doesn't fruit because it doesn't need to. Reproduction, in biological terms, is not a default state. It is a response to urgency. This is the insight that changes everything. And it's the insight that thousands of years of agricultural observation had already arrived at intuitively, long before Jaffe put it into a laboratory. Those Roman farmers beating their olive trees, those Japanese farmers striking their persimmon orchards in autumn, they had figured out, through pure observation across generations, that you had to interrupt the tree's comfort before the tree would commit to making fruit. They didn't know the cellular mechanisms. They didn't know about mechanosensing proteins embedded in plant cell membranes, or about the signaling cascades that translate physical pressure into hormonal change. But they had arrived at the same conclusion that modern plant science would eventually reach through decades of controlled research. The tree needs a reason to reproduce, and comfort is not that reason. What provides that reason, what translates a physical blow to the trunk into a biological decision to flower and fruit, is a molecule that most people have heard of, but very few understand in this context. And when you learn what that molecule is, and what industry has been doing with it for decades, while telling you to spend $50 on a bottle of Bloom Booster, the picture becomes considerably less comfortable. That molecule is ethylene, and its story is where everything gets much more interesting. Ethylene is one of the simplest organic molecules in existence. Two carbon atoms, four hydrogen atoms, a double bond between them, a structure so minimal it barely qualifies as complex chemistry. And yet this molecule, produced naturally inside every fruit tree you have ever seen, is the single most important chemical signal in the transition from vegetative growth to reproductive output. It is the biological difference between a tree that grows and a tree that fruits, and it has been at the center of a multi-billion-dollar industrial secret for longer than most people realize. When a tree experiences mechanical stress, when its trunk is struck, when its branches are bent, when its root system is disturbed by drought or pressure, the cells in the stressed tissue do something immediate and measurable. They activate an enzyme pathway called the ACC synthase pathway, which begins converting a common amino acid into a precursor molecule that, within hours, gets transformed into ethylene gas. The ethylene doesn't stay local. It moves through the tree's vascular tissue, spreading outward from the point of stress, and when it reaches the meristematic tissue, the actively growing regions near branch tips and flower buds, it delivers a signal that overrides the vegetative growth program entirely. The message, translated into biological terms, is unambiguous. Conditions have become unstable. Structural expansion is no longer the priority. Reproduction is. The tree responds by doing exactly what those ancient Mediterranean farmers observed it doing. It stops pushing energy into new leaves and branches, and it redirects that energy into floral initiation. Flower buds that had been sitting dormant begin to activate. Hormonal ratios shift. Gibberellins, which promote vegetative growth, are suppressed while the signals that promote flowering and fruiting move to the foreground. The tree, having received information that its physical situation may be deteriorating, makes the only logical biological decision available to it. If this might be my last season, I need to leave something behind. What makes this story considerably darker and considerably more relevant to every dollar you have ever spent on commercial fruit tree stimulants is what the agricultural industry learned about ethylene roughly a century ago, and what they have been doing with that knowledge ever since. By the 1930s, plant scientists working for large agricultural operations had identified ethylene as the primary hormone responsible for fruit ripening. By mid-century, the industry had developed synthetic ethylene delivery systems, most notably a compound called ethifon, which releases ethylene gas when it contacts plant tissue, and had begun using them at industrial scale. Today, ethafon and its derivatives are applied to an enormous range of commercial crops. Tomatoes picked green and ripened in storage facilities, pineapples synchronized to fruit simultaneously for harvest efficiency, cherries and walnuts treated to drop from trees on schedule for mechanical harvesting. The global market for synthetic ethylene-based agricultural chemicals currently sits at well over $4 billion annually, embedded within a broader crop stimulant and plant growth regulator market that exceeds $8 billion per year. The industry has known, with precise scientific certainty, for the better part of a century that ethylene triggers fruiting and ripening. They built an $8 billion market on that knowledge. And the thing they never had any financial interest in telling you, the thing that gets left out of every product label, every garden center consultation, every YouTube ad for Bloom Booster formula, is that your tree already knows how to produce ethylene. It has been doing it since long before the first synthetic version was ever manufactured. It just needs the right signal to do it in the right place at the right time. That signal costs nothing. It requires no chemistry degree, no monthly subscription to a gardening product service, no $45 bottle of anything. It requires understanding that the tree is not broken, not deficient, not in need of something you have to purchase. It requires understanding that the tree has been waiting, not for nutrients, but for information. Now, before this starts sounding like a guaranteed miracle cure for every unproductive tree in existence, there is something important that needs to be said clearly, because credibility matters more than a clean narrative. This mechanism does not work equally well in all situations, and applying it incorrectly can cause genuine harm. A tree that is actually nutrient deficient, root bound, or carrying a fungal infection is not going to respond to mechanical stimulation the way a healthy tree will, because its ethylene pathway is already dysregulated by other stressors, and adding physical stress on top of existing biological stress is more likely to push it toward decline than toward flowering. A very young tree still establishing its root system and vascular structure should never be subjected to trunk stress of any kind. And the force applied matters enormously. There is a significant biological difference between the level of mechanical stimulation that activates stress signaling pathways and the level that damages phloem tissue, which is the layer just beneath the bark responsible for transporting sugars throughout the tree. Damage the phloem, and you don't get more fruit. You get a dying tree. The technique works, and the science is unambiguous that it works. Specifically for trees that are mature, well-established, genuinely healthy, and stuck in what plant biologists call vegetative dominance, the condition of being so comfortable, so well-resourced, so free from threat, that the tree has simply never received a compelling biological reason to shift out of growth mode and into reproduction. Which brings us to the question that reframes this entire conversation. Not why does mechanical stress cause fruiting, but why do so many healthy, well-fed trees refuse to fruit in the first place? Why does comfort become the enemy of the harvest? There is a concept in plant biology that explains more about why your fruit tree isn't producing than any fertilizer deficiency chart ever will, and it is called vegetative dominance. It is not a disease. It is not a disorder. It is a perfectly rational biological strategy that your tree is executing with complete precision. And once you understand it, you will realize that the entire category of bloom booster products sitting on garden center shelves is, in a very specific and measurable sense, making the problem worse. A tree in vegetative dominance has made a calculation, not consciously, not with anything resembling intention, but at the level of hormonal balance and resource allocation. It has arrived at a position, the environment is stable, resources are sufficient, there is no detectable threat to survival, and therefore the optimal strategy is to continue expanding vegetative mass. More leaf area means more photosynthesis. More photosynthesis means more stored energy. More stored energy means a stronger, more competitive organism. From a purely evolutionary standpoint, in a stable and comfortable environment, this is correct behavior. The tree is not malfunctioning. It is functioning exactly as natural selection designed it to function when conditions are good. The problem, from your perspective as someone who planted that tree specifically to eat its fruit, is that conditions are good is precisely the state you have been working so hard to create. Every bag of balanced fertilizer you applied told the tree the soil was rich and reliable. Every consistent watering schedule told the tree water stress was not a concern. Every layer of protective mulch told the tree the root environment was stable and comfortable. You were, with the best possible intentions, sending the tree a continuous stream of signals that added up to a single biological message. There is no urgency here. Keep growing. There is no reason to reproduce yet. And the tree listened, because that is what trees do. They listen to their environment with extraordinary sensitivity, and they respond to what the environment is actually telling them, not to what you want them to do. This is the part of the conversation that the $200 billion fertilizer industry is structurally incapable of having with you, because the honest version of that conversation ends with you buying less of their product, not more. The honest version goes something like this. If your tree is healthy, well-fed, and refusing to fruit, adding more nutrients is almost certainly not the answer. Phosphorus supplements marketed specifically as bloom promoters, products that retail for anywhere between $30 and $80 for a single season supply, operate on the assumption that the tree is not flowering because it lacks the raw materials to build flowers. But a tree in vegetative dominance doesn't lack raw materials. It has raw materials in abundance. What it lacks is a reason to use them for reproduction rather than growth. Giving it more phosphorus in that situation is the equivalent of stocking someone's kitchen with more groceries when the reason they're not cooking is that they don't feel hungry yet. The ingredients were never the problem. The hormonal reality of vegetative dominance centers on a balance between two competing signals. Gibberellins, a class of growth hormones produced primarily in actively growing shoot tips, promote cell elongation, leaf expansion, and vegetative development. They are the hormones of abundance and expansion. Opposing them, in the context of reproductive transition, is the shift toward ethylene and toward a reduction in the auxin flow that keeps apical dominance, the prioritization of upward growth, in control. When gibberellin signaling is dominant and ethylene levels are low, the tree stays vegetative. When something disrupts that balance, when ethylene rises, when gibberellin production is interrupted, when the tree's stress-sensing system detects instability, the hormonal ratio shifts, and the meristematic tissue that was building leaves begins building flowers instead. Mechanical stress tips that balance directly. A firm strike to the trunk travels through the wood as a pressure wave, activates mechanosensitive ion channels in cells throughout the stressed tissue, triggers the ACC synthase pathway, and within 12 to 72 hours produces a measurable increase in ethylene concentration in the cambial and meristematic tissue. The gibberellin to ethylene ratio shifts. Vegetative dominance is interrupted. The tree, reading its environment as suddenly less stable than it was, reassigns its resources. What is particularly striking about this, and what makes the gap between traditional agricultural knowledge and modern commercial gardening advice so difficult to explain charitably, is that the transition from vegetative growth to reproductive output triggered by mechanical stress produces results that are, in documented research trials, comparable to those achieved by commercial plant growth regulators at a fraction of the cost. A 2003 study examining mechanical stimulation effects on apple tree flowering found statistically significant increases in flower bud initiation following trunk stress treatments. Research on citrus trees has shown similar results. The mechanism is not obscure, not contested, not preliminary. It is established plant science. It simply exists in academic literature rather than on a product label, which means it has no marketing budget, no retail placement, and no financial constituency pushing it into the mainstream conversation. You are not a gardener who has been failing. You are a gardener who has been shopping in a store that was never designed to give you the one piece of information that would have solved your problem for free. That changes right now. So here's exactly what you do. Not approximately, not in theory, exactly with the specific details that separate a technique that works from one that causes damage through careless application. The first thing you need to establish before touching the tree at all is whether your tree is actually a candidate for this method. The technique works specifically on trees that meet all of the following conditions simultaneously. The tree is at least 3 to 4 years old and has been in the ground long enough to have developed a fully established root system. The tree is genuinely healthy, meaning the foliage is full and green. There are no visible signs of fungal infection or pest damage on the bark or leaves, and the tree has been growing vigorously. And the tree has been in vegetative dominance for at least one full season, meaning it grew well last year, but produced little or no fruit despite apparently good conditions. If your tree is struggling, if the leaves are yellowing, if growth has been weak, if the bark shows any cracking, discoloration, or unusual texture, stop. That tree needs diagnosis and treatment, not mechanical stimulation. Stressing an already compromised tree does not trigger the survival reproduction response. It accelerates decline. Assuming your tree qualifies, timing is the single most important variable in the entire process. You want to apply mechanical stimulation at the point in the growing season when the tree is transitioning from dormancy into active growth, when the buds are beginning to swell but before significant leaf out has occurred. In most temperate climates, this window falls in early to mid-spring, typically somewhere between late February and early April, depending on your specific location and the particular species you are working with. The reason this timing matters so much comes back directly to the hormonal biology covered earlier. You are trying to introduce an ethylene signal at precisely the moment when the meristematic tissue is making its initial allocation decisions for the season, before it has fully committed to vegetative growth, while it is still in the phase where a stress signal can redirect that commitment toward floral initiation. Apply the technique too early, while the tree is still fully dormant, and the hormonal machinery that responds to ethylene isn't yet active enough to redirect growth. Apply it too late, after full leaf out and the vegetative program is already running at full speed. The resource allocation decisions have already been made, and the signal arrives too late to change them for this season. For the tool, you have two good options and one important boundary: a newspaper rolled as tightly as you can manage. The tighter the roll, the more concentrated the pressure wave it delivers. Works very well and has the additional advantage of being something that most people have within arm's reach. A length of rubber hose or a soft rubber mallet achieves a similar result. What you are looking for in a tool is something that delivers a firm, focused pressure without being hard enough to break bark or compress the cambium. This is the boundary. Do not use a wooden club, a metal tool, a hammer, or anything rigid enough that a firm swing could crack or dent the bark surface. The bark must remain visually intact after treatment. If you see cracking, splitting, or any depression in the bark surface after a strike, you have applied too much force with too hard an implement, and you need to stop and monitor that area for signs of infection over the following weeks. The strikes themselves should be applied to the main trunk in the section between approximately 12 inches above the soil line and the point where the first major branches begin. You are targeting the section of trunk where the vascular tissue is most concentrated and where a pressure wave will travel most efficiently into the tree's internal signaling system. Strike with a motion that is firm and deliberate, comparable in force to knocking hard on a solid wooden door, and work your way around the circumference of the trunk, delivering strikes roughly every 3 to 4 inches around the full circle. One complete pass around the trunk is sufficient for most trees. For a larger tree with a trunk diameter above 6 inches, 2 passes on different days spaced about a week apart will produce a stronger signal without concentrating stress in a single event. After treatment, do not fertilize heavily for at least 6 weeks. This is critical, and it is the step that most people get wrong because it runs against every instinct developed by years of conventional gardening advice. What you have just done is send the tree a signal of environmental instability. If you immediately follow that signal with a heavy nitrogen application, you are flooding the tree with the exact hormonal precursors that promote vegetative growth, directly counteracting the ethylene signal you just worked to create. Let the tree sit with the stress signal. Water normally. If the soil is genuinely poor, a light application of low nitrogen fertilizer with moderate phosphorus is acceptable. But the goal for the 6 weeks following treatment is to avoid telling the tree that everything is fine and resources are abundant. Watch for signs of response over the 4 to 10 weeks following treatment. In a tree that has responded well, you will typically see a slowing of vegetative shoot extension. The long, vigorous new shoots that a tree in vegetative dominance throws out early in the season will be shorter and fewer than in previous years. This is not a sign that the tree is struggling. It is a sign that resource allocation has shifted. Shortly after, in a successful response, you will begin to see flower bud development at branch tips and lateral spurs that in previous seasons produced only leaves. If the tree shows no response in the first season, the technique can be repeated the following spring with slightly increased intensity. Some trees, particularly those that have been in deep vegetative dominance for many years, require 2 seasons of mechanical stimulation before the hormonal balance shifts convincingly. Patience here is not passive waiting, it is part of the method. There are 2 variation techniques worth knowing for situations where trunk striking alone may not be sufficient. The first is partial girdling, using a sharp knife to cut a shallow groove through the outer bark in a 3/4 circle around the trunk, stopping before completing the full circle to avoid cutting off water flow entirely. This interrupts the downward flow of sugars through the phloem on the cut side, creating a localized accumulation of carbohydrates above the cut that further shifts the hormonal balance toward reproduction. It is more invasive than trunk striking and should be approached carefully, but it has a documented history stretching from Roman agricultural practice through to modern commercial orcharding, where partial girdling of grapevines and some tree fruits is still used as a standard yield management technique. The second variation is branch positioning, bending vigorous upright shoots downward and securing them in a more horizontal position for 4 to 6 weeks in early spring. Horizontal branches experience reduced auxin flow from the apical meristem, which reduces their vegetative dominance and promotes lateral flower bud formation. This technique requires no tools beyond a few lengths of soft garden tie and produces no bark stress whatsoever, making it the preferred first approach for younger trees or trees where you want to avoid any risk of bark damage. The knowledge sitting in these 3 techniques, trunk stimulation, partial girdling, and branch positioning, represents several thousand years of accumulated agricultural observation, confirmed by 20th and 21st century plant science, available to you right now for a cost that rounds to zero. It was always yours. It was just never sold to you because you cannot build a $200 billion industry on telling people to roll up a newspaper. There is a moment that happens for a lot of people somewhere in the middle of learning something like this. A moment where the information stops feeling like a gardening tip and starts feeling like something else entirely. Like a small but significant realization about the relationship between what you have been told you need and what you actually need. About the distance between the solution that costs money and the solution that costs nothing. About how much of what gets marketed as expertise is really just the commercialization of knowledge that was freely available long before anyone figured out how to put it in a bottle and charge $50 for it. That moment is worth sitting with because it extends well beyond fruit trees. The story of thigmomorphogenesis, of ethylene and vegetative dominance, and the ancient farmers who understood intuitively what took 20th century science decades to formally document, is not really a story about a gardening technique. It is a story about what happens to traditional knowledge when industrial interests grow large enough to replace it. It is a story about a $200 billion fertilizer market and an $8 billion plant growth regulator market that are both built, at least in part, on the systematic displacement of methods that predate them by thousands of years and cost nothing to implement. It is a story about the difference between a knowledge system designed to make you capable and a knowledge system designed to make you dependent. The farmers who beat their olive trees in ancient Greece were not primitive. They were not superstitious. They were practitioners of an empirical tradition, observation, hypothesis, repeated application, refinement across generations, that arrived at scientifically valid conclusions through a completely different pathway than the one we now call research. They did not need a laboratory to understand that a threatened tree fruits and a comfortable tree grows. They needed only to pay close attention to what trees actually do and to pass that attention forward across generations without letting anyone convince them that the old ways were inferior to whatever was currently being sold. That chain of attention was broken, not violently, not through any single dramatic event, but gradually and commercially, through the slow, consistent message that modern products were more reliable, more scientific, more effective than the accumulated knowledge of people who had been growing food for millennia without buying anything. Some of that message was true. Genuine advances in plant science have produced real benefits for agriculture. But some of it, a significant portion of what gets sold in garden centers and agricultural supply catalogs every year, is a commercial layer placed over knowledge that was already complete, already functional, already yours. What you do with that understanding is, of course, entirely your choice. You can walk into a garden center next spring and buy the bloom booster and the phosphorus supplement and the synthetic hormone spray, and your tree may or may not respond, and the industry that sold them to you will continue operating at $200 billion per year regardless. Or you can roll up a newspaper, walk out to that tree in early spring when the buds are just beginning to swell, and deliver the oldest, most scientifically grounded message in the history of fruit growing. I need you to remember that this matters, that this season counts, that the time to give everything you have is right now. The tree will understand. It has always understood. It was just waiting for someone to speak the right language. If this changed the way you think about what your garden actually needs, not just the tree, but all of it, the soil, the water, the inputs you've been buying on the assumption that more is always better, then share this with someone who has a tree that isn't producing. Not as a gardening tip, as a piece of information that belongs to them and was never supposed to cost anything. That is how this kind of knowledge survives. Not through algorithms, not through advertising budgets, but through people who found something real and decided it was worth passing on. The next video is going to go even deeper into this idea, into a technique that ancient Chinese farmers used to transform completely exhausted, compacted soil into some of the most productive growing ground imaginable, using nothing but time, observation, and a material that every single person watching this already has access to for free. If what you heard today made you question one assumption about what your garden needs, what comes next will make you question several more.